Stop explaining yourself, because every word you offer to the world is a piece of your power that you will never get back. Most people move through life as an open book. They announce their plans, they share their pain, they perform their ambition on every available surface, hungry for validation, mistaking visibility for strength. They post the gym session before the sweat dries. They tell people about the business before the first dollar is made. They explain the silence, justify the distance, narrate every interior movement as though the world is owed a commentary track on their becoming. And the world consumes it effortlessly, without gratitude. Because here is what no one tells you about constant visibility. It doesn't make people respect you more. It makes them comfortable around you. And comfortable is the opposite of formidable. The most dangerous people in history were not the loudest ones in the room. They were the ones you couldn't read, the ones whose next move lived in shadow, the ones who had mastered the ancient, terrifying discipline of becoming less visible, less predictable, less available, until the silence around them held more weight than most people's loudest declarations. This is the power of the ghost, not absence for the sake of drama, but disappearance as a deliberate psychological architecture, built in silence, perfected in the dark. There's a concept in social psychology called the transparency illusion. It describes the deeply human tendency to overestimate how much of our internal world is visible to others. People who are anxious believe their anxiety is obvious. People who are uncertain believe their uncertainty is written across their face. And so they compensate, they over-explain, they fill silence with nervous words. They perform confidence instead of cultivating it, because somewhere deep in the nervous system lives the ancient terror of being misread, of being seen as less than what they are. But the cruel irony is that the more aggressively a person tries to control how they are perceived, the more transparent their insecurity becomes. The executive who constantly reminds the room of their credentials, the friend who never stops talking about their own transformation, the person who announces every boundary before it's even been crossed, these are not signals of power. These are distress flares, and the psychologically sophisticated people around them read every one. True power does not announce itself. It doesn't need to. It operates through presence, not performance, through weight, not volume. And the first step towards that kind of power is the willingness to let the world misunderstand you without rushing to correct them. This is what the ghost understands that the performer will never. The less information you give people, the more power your actual presence commands. Mystery is not a manipulation tactic. It is the natural result of a person who has stopped outsourcing their identity to the opinions of others and begun to build something real, in private, in silence, in the kind of disciplined solitude that most people are too frightened to endure. Marcus Aurelius wrote his most profound thoughts in a private journal never intended for publication, not to an audience, not to posterity, to himself. The meditations were not a performance. They were a man holding himself accountable in the dark, wrestling with failure and weakness and ambition without a single witness. And perhaps that is precisely why they have survived 2,000 years with more psychological force than most public declarations ever managed. Silence for the Stoics was not emptiness. It was discipline made visible, or rather made invisible, which is the deeper discipline entirely. Seneca wrote that the crowd is the enemy of real development, not because people are inherently destructive, but because the social environment constantly pulls a developing mind towards performance instead of substance. Every gathering becomes an audition. Every relationship becomes a mirror you pose in front of instead of a window you see through. And slowly, without noticing the shift, a person stops building themselves and starts building a version of themselves designed to be approved by people whose own foundations are equally unstable. The ghost breaks this cycle not by becoming antisocial, but by becoming strategically invisible during the periods of construction that matter most. A building under construction is covered in scaffolding. You cannot see its true shape. You cannot assess its final strength. The most dangerous mistake a builder can make is to remove the scaffolding early to show the world what it's becoming before it can bear its own weight. And yet, this is exactly what most people do. With their lives, their goals, their transformations, they tear down the scaffolding for applause and then collapse quietly under the weight of expectations they were never ready to hold.
Watch what happens in the social ecosystem when someone goes quiet. When a person who was once vocal and available suddenly becomes unreachable. When the constant stream of updates, opinions, and emotional disclosures simply stops. People notice, and not in the way they notice the loud ones. They notice the way you notice a sound that suddenly disappears in a room you forgot was filled with it. There is a dissonance, a gap, a question mark where there used to be a familiar, manageable presence. And in that gap, the mind of every observer begins to fill the silence with projection. This is the psychological phenomenon the ghost weaponizes without lifting a finger, because the human brain abhors a social vacuum. When information is absent, imagination activates. When your motivations are unclear, people assign you intentions you never had. When your face becomes harder to read, your presence begins to feel larger than your physical reality. Power in the social domain is largely a function of perceived depth, and depth is not something you can perform. It is something you must actually have, or something you must allow others to project onto you by giving them so little surface information that the depth becomes a story they tell themselves about you, one you never had to write. This is not deception. This is the understanding that most of what humans call knowing someone is actually the story they've assembled from the data you provided. Reduce the data, complicate the story, and watch the dynamic of every relationship and professional interaction shift in your direction. There is a specific kind of silence that the undeveloped person cannot survive. It is the silence that follows withdrawal from social validation, the silence of an unanswered message, of a week spent without posting, of a room entered without announcing yourself. For the person whose identity has been built on visibility and response, this silence feels like dying. And that feeling is not a sign that something is wrong. It is a sign that something is finally beginning. Because you cannot build a self that does not depend on external approval while simultaneously feeding on external approval. The withdrawal is not punishment, it is surgery. It is the necessary removal of a dependency so subtle and so socially normalized that most people never even identify it as an addiction, even as it quietly controls every decision they make about who to be, what to say, where to go, and how to present themselves to a world they have learned to fear disappointing. The ghost period is the detox. It is the season of sitting with your own thoughts long enough to hear which ones are actually yours and which ones are the internalized voices of every person whose approval you have been quietly chasing for years. It is the uncomfortable, clarifying, brutal experience of discovering that you don't actually know what you want when you remove the question of what would impress the most people. It is the terrifying and liberating realization that you have been performing a character in a play no one asked you to be in for an audience that will forget you between acts. The most powerful transformation available to a human being is the transformation that no one witnesses, not because privacy makes it more legitimate, but because the absence of an audience removes the most corrupting variable in any process of growth: the temptation to optimize for perception rather than truth. When no one is watching, you cannot lie to yourself about why you're doing what you're doing. You cannot confuse the feeling of being admired for the feeling of actually becoming something. The feedback loop collapses, and what remains is just you and the work and the discipline which either exists or it doesn't, with no applause to paper over the gap. The ghost emerges from this season changed in a way that is almost impossible to articulate to people who have not lived it. Not louder, not more impressive on the surface, but denser, more settled, carrying a weight of internal certainty that was built without anyone's help and therefore cannot be dismantled by anyone's disapproval. And when that person re-enters the room, something has shifted that no one can name, but everyone can feel. You will not need to explain where you were.
you will not need to announce what changed, because the person who returns from genuine solitude does not perform their transformation. They simply occupy space differently. They speak less and mean more. They move without urgency and arrive with gravity. They have stopped asking the world to confirm their value because they finally built a version of themselves that doesn't need the answer. And the world, almost without knowing why, leans forward to hear what someone like that will say next, sensing at the edge of its understanding that it is in the presence of something it cannot easily consume, cannot easily categorize, and therefore cannot easily dismiss, which is exactly where your power was always waiting for you to find it.